My parents tossed me aside at 12. For new families, forgot my birthdays and graduation, sneering, "You're not our priority anymore." Years of heartbreaking silence followed. You know what people don't tell you about divorce? It's not just the breaking apart of two people. Sometimes it's the quiet surgical erasure of a child caught in between, like I was. I was 12 when my parents sat me down at the kitchen table, sunlight painting golden rectangles on the floor, pancakes steaming in front of me. The setting was warm, familiar, comforting. And then came the words, "We've decided to separate." No yelling, no tears, just cold efficiency, like they were discussing splitting up a timeshare. They told me it would be amicable, that I'd still be their top priority. But I saw it in their eyes, how quickly they shifted the focus back to themselves, their futures, their new beginnings. In that moment, I wasn't a child. I was baggage. And they didn't just divorce each other. They divorced me. Within weeks, my world was unrecognizable. My room became a guest room, my school schedule an inconvenience, my birthday a forgotten calendar event. I watched my mother reinvent herself with a new partner, radiant and beaming over the baby she now had time and energy for. I watched my father remarry a woman who looked through me like I was just dust on a picture frame. Her twin sons referring to me as that leftover kid. They didn't yell, they didn't hit, they just disappeared. In their shiny new lives, I was an error in the system. A ghost lingering at the edge of family photos I was no longer invited to take. And the only person who kept me tethered to reality was Aunt Clara, my dad's sister. Quiet, unfussy, endlessly kind. She didn't have much, but her home smelled like soil and safety. She remembered my birthdays. She came to my school plays. She made me feel like I mattered. And then, one morning, everything changed. Grandpa died, and to everyone's shock, he left every cent of his fortune, $1 million, not to his kids, not split between relatives, but directly to Aunt Clara. And Aunt Clara gave all of it to me. Every single dollar. At first, I couldn't breathe. I thought about what that meant for my future, for the years I'd spent scraping by emotionally and financially. But before I could even process it, the phone calls started. Mom, Dad. Their voices suddenly syrupy with nostalgia, overflowing with love, crying, laughing, asking if I remembered our favorite pancake breakfasts, or how we used to play board games on Sundays. It was like watching actors return to a stage they'd long abandoned. Only now, they weren't after me. They were after the money clinging to my name. And the look in their eyes when they realized Aunt Clara had handed me the golden ticket? It wasn't love. It wasn't pride. It was hunger. Predatory. Calculated. And terrifying. This wasn't a reunion. It was a hunt. And I was the prey, holding $1 million scent they could finally smell again. The weeks following that devastating kitchen table pronouncement bled into a nightmarish blur of fractured routines and jarring new realities. The joint custody they'd so clinically described translated into a disorienting weekly shuffle between two households that felt less like homes and more like alien territories, where I was a perpetual unwelcome guest. At Mom's new apartment, a place that always smelled faintly of her boyfriend's cloying cologne and a desperate attempt at new beginnings, her pregnancy quickly became the sun around which her entire existence revolved. She'd pat her swelling belly with a beatific smile, discussing baby names and nursery colors with her new man, while I hovered on the periphery, an awkward ghost in their love story. I remember her boyfriend once catching me staring at a photo of them, all beaming smiles and intertwined hands, and he'd thrown an arm around Mom's shoulder, pulling her closer, and said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, "Big changes. Sport? Better get used to being a big brother." His words, meant to be inclusive perhaps, only amplified my sense of displacement. Their public displays of affection were relentless and mortifying. Lingering kisses over breakfast, hands constantly intertwined, whispered sweet nothings exchanged right in front of me as if I were invisible. It made my skin crawl, a hot wave of embarrassment and an acute awareness of my utter irrelevance washing over me. The promised shared vacations quickly devolved into exercises in elaborate exclusion. There was one particularly scarring trip to a lakeside cabin shortly after Mom announced her pregnancy. While she and her boyfriend spent hours sunbathing on the dock, their laughter and splashes echoing across the water, I was confined to a tiny, sweltering attic room, supposedly to give them some adult time. The excuse was paper thin. I could hear their muffled voices, their bursts of laughter, and other, more intimate sounds that seeped through the floorboards, each one a fresh stab of loneliness and the chilling realization that I was an obstacle to their happiness. I spent those 2 days staring at the cracked ceiling, the silence of my isolation punctuated only by their distant joy, feeling more like a piece of inconvenient luggage than a son. After that weekend, the thought of spending time at Mom's filled me with a dread so profound it settled like lead in my stomach. Dad's new house, if possible, was even worse. His new wife, a woman whose smile never quite reached her cold, assessing eyes, made it abundantly clear from day one that I was an unwelcome fixture. Her twin sons, emboldened by their mother's thinly veiled animosity, turned my existence into a daily gauntlet of torment. It started with small things: my school books hidden, my favorite worn t-shirt ending up accidentally in the trash, sarcastic whispers about Dad's charity case whenever I entered a room. Then it escalated. I'll never forget the afternoon they cornered me in the backyard, their faces identical masks of sneering malice, and systematically broke the carefully constructed model airplane Grandpa had helped me build the summer before, the only tangible link to a time when I felt even remotely cherished. They laughed as the delicate balsa wood splintered under their boots, their eyes daring me to react. When I finally tearfully told Dad, he just sighed, that familiar look of weary resignation settling on his features. He mumbled something about boys being boys and offered a hollow promise of a father-son fishing trip. Next week, just us. Of course, that next week never came. It always coincided with my scheduled rotation to Mom's, a convenient deferral that quickly became the soundtrack to my disappointment. His new wife would often interject during these feeble attempts at paternal connection, her voice dripping with false sweetness, suggesting that perhaps the boys would feel left out, or that maybe I would prefer to do something quieter. Dad invariably would fold, his promises dissolving like smoke. It was on one of those bleak evenings, after another broken promise and another sneering dismissal from my stepmother, that the thought of Aunt Clara's quiet, unassuming house began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like the only sanctuary left in a world determined to erase me. The definitive shift, the moment I subconsciously decided I could no longer endure the weekly crucifixion of my spirit, wasn't marked by a grand explosion, but by a quiet, soul-crushing accumulation of slights. It was perhaps after one particularly vicious verbal assault from my stepmother, where she'd called me a sullen, ungrateful leech in front of a smirking Dad who offered no defense. Or maybe it was the week Mom forgot. It was her turn to have me, leaving me stranded outside her locked apartment building for hours in the pouring rain until a neighbor took pity. Whatever the final catalyst, I found myself one bleak November afternoon, soaked to the bone and shivering, not on Mom's or Dad's doorstep, but on Aunt Clara's. My cheap backpack, holding all my worldly possessions, dripped a pathetic puddle onto her welcome mat. I didn't have to explain. The look in my eyes, the tremor in my voice, as I asked if I could just stay for a bit, told her everything. She simply enveloped me in a hug that smelled of cinnamon and damp earth from her beloved garden, led me inside, and drew a hot bath. That night, tucked into the small guest bed that would become my own, listening to the gentle hum of her old house, a fragile sense of peace began to settle over me. The most damning indictment of my parents' monumental neglect came almost 3 months later. Aunt Clara recounted the phone call with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Mom had breezily called Dad to coordinate some holiday detail for her new family, and as an afterthought, she'd let a question slip, something like, "Oh, by the way, how's, the boy doing over at your place this month?" Dad, equally casual, had replied, "What are you talking about? He's been with you, hasn't he?" Aunt Clara described the chilling pause that followed. Then Dad's confused, almost irritated voice saying, "Well, if he's not with you, and he's clearly not with me, where the hell is he?" 3 months, 90 days of my 12-year-old life had vanished from their radar, unnoticed, unremarked upon, like a misplaced set of keys. They were too busy orchestrating their perfect new existences, celebrating new milestones with new children, to realize one of their original children had simply ceased to exist within their gilded cages. The knowledge that my absence was less significant than a forgotten dental appointment carved a canyon of grief within me. Life with Aunt Clara was the antithesis of the emotional minefields I'd navigated before. Her love wasn't conditional, her attention wasn't a currency to be earned. She remembered my favorite foods, quietly helped me with the math homework that always made my head spin, and most importantly, she listened, really listened. There were impromptu trips to the local diner for greasy burgers and milkshakes, cozy evenings spent watching old movies, and always, the comforting presence of her plants. A silent green army that seemed to absorb the lingering sadness within me. I started working in her small plant nursery after school. The earthy scent of soil and the quiet satisfaction of nurturing something, of watching it grow under my care, becoming a strange sort of therapy. The summer visits to Grandpa's farm continued, now with Aunt Clara by my side. Grandpa, with his gruff exterior and surprisingly gentle hands, would teach me about the land, about the constellations, his stories weaving a tapestry of connection that I'd never known. These moments were oases of peace in the desert of my childhood. The financial lifeline from my father predictably frayed and then snapped. The monthly allowance he initially sent to Aunt Clara became sporadic, then vanished. Aunt Clara never once made me feel the pinch, quietly absorbing the cost. Her sacrifice is a silent testament to her love. But the forgotten birthdays were like fresh wounds each year. My 13th, 14th, 15th, all passed with an aching silence from my parents. Aunt Clara would bake a small cake, her cheerfulness a brave shield against my unspoken disappointment. Only after her pointed, often exasperated reminder calls would one of them phone, their voices rushed, their "Happy birthday, son, we love you so much," sounding hollow and obligatory, before they'd inevitably cut the call short with some vague excuse. One winter, a brutal flu laid me low for a week. Aunt Clara nursed me with unwavering patience, spooning soup into me, checking my fever. She called both my parents, her voice tight with worry. Neither came. Neither even called back to check on me. The absolute nadir of their neglect, the moment that hammered the final nail into the coffin of any lingering hope, was my high school graduation. A day meant for pride, for family, for celebrating a significant achievement. As I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, my eyes scanned the crowd, searching despite everything for a familiar face. All I saw were other families, beaming, cheering, engulfing their graduates in hugs. The seats where my parents should have been were starkly, painfully empty. Only Aunt Clara was there, her applause ringing out, her proud tears a beacon of solitary love in that vast auditorium. Later, when she confronted them separately about their callous absence, they each offered me a string of pathetic, easily disproven excuses via curt phone calls. A last-minute crisis at work, a sudden illness in the new family. Their apologies were weightless, empty. It was then, listening to their insincere regrets, that something inside me finally, irrevocably snapped. The resentment I'd suppressed for years surged forth, cold and hard. I started letting their calls go to voicemail, the sound of their voices an intolerable irritant. And soon, they stopped calling altogether, their narrative shifting seamlessly to one where I was the problem. The rude, ungrateful, difficult son who refused to communicate. I didn't fight it. Let them have their story. I was too busy trying to build my own brick by painful brick, out of the rubble they'd left behind. University life was a whirlwind of newfound independence and intellectual challenges. I moved out of Aunt Clara's comforting embrace into a sterile dorm room, a tiny box that nonetheless felt like a kingdom because it was mine. But the physical distance did little to diminish the bond Aunt Clara and I shared. If anything, it deepened. I made it a point to travel back to her house, my true home, for every holiday, every birthday, meticulously saving from my meager part-time job earnings to buy her small tokens of my immense gratitude. She'd fuss over me, ensuring I was eating properly. Her quiet questions about my studies and my well-being, a stark contrast to the years of parental indifference. I remember one particularly bleak Thanksgiving during my sophomore year when I couldn't afford the trip home. Aunt Clara, without a word of complaint, packed a massive care package filled with homemade cookies, her famous apple pie, and a hand-knitted scarf, and drove 3 hours through a snowstorm just to share a meal with me in my cramped dorm common room. It was moments like these, small acts of unwavering love, that stitched together the tattered edges of my young adulthood. I was in my final year, neck deep in thesis research and the anxiety of impending graduation, when Aunt Clara called, her voice uncharacteristically strained. Grandpa, her father, the gruff, kind-hearted farmer whose stories and quiet affection had been a rare beacon of warmth in my childhood, was gravely ill. He'd been a fixture on those idyllic summer visits to his sprawling farm, a place of sun-drenched fields and the earthy scent of honest work. Aunt Clara and I had always been the ones to make the effort, to sit with him on his porch swing, listening to his tales of the old days. My own father and his equally distant brothers had long relegated Grandpa to the periphery of their busy, self-important lives. Their visits perfunctory, their excuses for absence plentiful. The hypocrisy was therefore almost unbearable when they all materialized at Grandpa's funeral, a somber parade of dark suits and carefully arranged expressions of grief. I watched my father, a man who hadn't found time to visit his ailing parent in months, now dabbing at his eyes with a pristine handkerchief. It was a performance, and a sickeningly unconvincing one at that. The real drama, however, unfolded a few days later, in the hushed wood-paneled office of Grandpa's lawyer. The air was thick with unspoken tension and the rustle of expensive fabrics as my father and uncles awaited the reading of the will. Their feigned sorrow had been replaced by a barely concealed twitchy anticipation. The lawyer, a man with a face like old parchment, finally cleared his throat and began to read. The silence in the room became absolute as he detailed Grandpa's final wishes. The entire 150-acre farmland, the beloved old farmhouse, and a staggering $1 million in cash were bequeathed solely and entirely to his devoted daughter, Clara. The remainder of his considerable estate was to be divided amongst various agricultural charities he'd championed. A collective gasp, sharp and venomous, sucked the air from the room. I saw my father's face contort, a mask of disbelief hardening into furious resentment. One of my uncles actually slammed his fist on the polished mahogany table, a muttered curse escaping his lips. Grandpa, it was revealed, had spent his final months asking for his sons, his heart heavy with their neglect. Only Aunt Clara had answered his silent call, moving in with him, tending to his needs, offering solace when his own blood had offered only excuses. A week later, Aunt Clara summoned me to her house. The atmosphere was imbued with a quiet solemnity. She sat me down in her sun-drenched kitchen, a place of countless comforting cups of tea and quiet conversations, and her eyes, though tinged with the sadness of her recent loss, held a new, unwavering light. She spoke of Grandpa's quiet wisdom, his disappointment in his sons, but also his deep, abiding affection for me, the grandson who had always sought his company. She reminded me of the countless times I'd sat with her, animatedly describing my youthful, ambitious dreams of one day starting my own small tech company, a venture that seemed impossibly distant given my circumstances. Then, with a gentle smile that radiated pure, unconditional love, she told me she was giving the entire $1 million, Grandpa's legacy to me. The world tilted on its axis. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. It wasn't just the astronomical sum, a figure so vast it felt unreal. It was the sheer, overwhelming force of her belief in me, her selfless generosity that mirrored the love I had so desperately craved and been denied by my own parents. Your grandpa knew my heart, and he knew yours, dear boy, she said softly, her hand covering mine. He wanted you to have a future, the one you deserve. Use this to build your dream. The carefully constructed dam I'd built around my emotions for so many years finally shattered. I didn't just cry, I sobbed great, heaving gasps of gratitude, of pain released, of a hope so blindingly bright it was almost terrifying, clinging to her as if she were the only solid thing in a reeling universe. This gift wasn't just money, it was a chance, a validation, a future, all bestowed by the one person who had never, not once, let me down. The news of my $1 million inheritance, a gift of pure love from Aunt Clara, rippled through the stagnant waters of my parents' lives with the force of a depth charge. Suddenly, I, the forgotten son, the inconvenient ghost of their pasts, became the most sought-after person in their universe. My phone, long accustomed to their neglectful silence, began to detonate with an almost comical frequency. Calls from Mom, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness I hadn't heard since I was small enough to believe her lies. Texts from Dad, filled with sudden effusive pride in my boy. It was a full-scale love-bombing operation, so transparently orchestrated it was almost insulting. I met their advances with a wall of cold politeness, curtly informing them that their sudden affection was about a decade too late and $1 million too obvious. But they were like relentless hounds on a scent, their desperation palpable. The initial salvos were aimed at my upcoming university graduation, an event they hadn't given a passing thought to until my bank account swelled. Dad materialized at my dorm, uninvited, his face a mask of paternal pride as he gushed about how he'd always known I was special. He feigned amnesia regarding the years of missed birthdays and the hollow ache of his absence at my high school graduation, casually suggesting I was still mad about the divorce and that it was time to move on. He painted a picture of a pining, mother and a longing father, desperate to celebrate my success. I saw right through it, the dollar signs practically flashing in his eyes. Mom echoed his performance in a tearful voicemail, her voice cracking with emotion as she spoke of their shared dreams for my academic triumph. Their attempts to secure an invitation were so blatant, so pathetically transparent, that I simply stopped responding. Predictably, once it became clear I wouldn't be swayed into a premature reunion, neither of them even bothered to ask for the actual date of the ceremony. The proud moment was swiftly forgotten. Then came the more direct financial assaults, each one a fresh twist of the knife. Mom called, her voice oozing with false concern, to inform me that my half-sister, a child whose face I couldn't even picture, desperately needed to attend an elite private school. "She's your sister, darling," Mom had purred, "and you have all that lovely money from Grandpa. It's your duty to help." When I flatly refused, reminding her of her own parental duties she'd so spectacularly failed, her sugary facade crumbled into a torrent of accusations about me being ungrateful and stuck in the past. Shortly after, a collections agent from a bank contacted me regarding Dad's defaulted mortgage. He'd brazenly given them my number as a potential payer. A quick call to a lawyer friend confirmed I was under no legal obligation. My refusal to bail him out triggered a barrage of vitriol from his wife, screaming down the phone about my heartlessness. Dad himself followed up with a late-night, whiskey-fueled call, sobbing about his mistakes, his regrets, his desperate situation, all punctuated by not-so-subtle hints about how a son should support his father. Each calculated plea, each manipulative tactic, only served to harden my resolve, chipping away at any lingering vestiges of childish hope. The grand, inevitable showdown, however, was orchestrated by Mom under the guise of a reconciliation dinner. "Just the three of us, baby," her message had cooed. "Like old times, to heal and reconnect." Despite every fiber of my being screaming against it, a grim, morbid curiosity compelled me to attend. I needed to see this tragic comedy play out to its bitter end. The restaurant was oppressively expensive, the air thick with the cloying scent of their insincerity. They were a tag team of performative remorse, their apologies flowing as freely as the overpriced wine. They spoke of mistakes made, of lessons learned, of their undying, recently rediscovered love for me. I nodded, offered noncommittal grunts, a silent spectator at my own emotional dissection. Then, as the waiter cleared our main course plates, Mom leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light, Dad nodding eagerly beside her. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "now that you're comfortable, Dad and I were thinking. We have so much experience, you know. We could offer you some wonderful investment advice. You're so young, it's easy to make mistakes with such a large sum." My father chimed in about a small, temporary issue with his mortgage, directly linked to his sacrifices for his stepson's college fund, and Mom quickly added the pressing need for my half-sister's superior education. The audacity of it, the sheer, unadulterated greed painted on their faces, was almost breathtaking. When I calmly stated that Aunt Clara was already assisting me with financial planning, Mom's carefully constructed mask of maternal concern shattered. "Aunt Clara!" she shrieked, her voice rising to an embarrassing pitch, drawing stares from adjacent tables. "What does she know? We're your parents. You ungrateful, attention-seeking brat. After everything we've done for you, you'd rather trust her?" Her face was a rictus of fury. "You always were selfish, only ever thinking about yourself." I looked at them then, truly looked at them. Two grasping, desperate people, forever trapped in their own destructive narratives. A chilling calm settled over me. "Yes," I said, my voice quiet but carrying an undeniable finality. "That is what I am, because that is precisely what you taught me to be." I rose slowly, deliberately pulling out my wallet. This charade was always about the money, wasn't it? I placed enough cash on the table to cover my share of the disastrous meal. "And for the record," I met their stunned, hate-filled gazes, "you will not receive a single, solitary penny." Then, without a backward glance, I turned and walked out, leaving them to stew in the bitter dregs of their own making. The restaurant door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing the final, definitive closure of a painful chapter. Stepping into the cool night air, I inhaled deeply. It tasted of freedom, sharp and clean. There was no elation, no theatrical triumph, just a vast, quiet emptiness where the constant ache of their neglect had resided for so long. Their shocked, sputtering faces were a fading image, irrelevant. The charade was over. The $1 million hadn't brought them back. It had merely held up a merciless mirror to the truth. They were never truly there. That stark realization was my peace. Before I even reached my car, their numbers were gone from my phone, their presence erased from my future. The door to that past wasn't just closed, it was incinerated. They wanted a son to fix their lives? They should have tried being parents. My life finally was my own.